Burn the witch. That was what ignorant men would say during the early colonial period in Massachusetts whenever they saw or heard something that they couldn't explain. And because these men were uneducated and concerned about maintaining their own power in society, they pointed their fingers and turned their attacks on any and all women who challenged the status quo. And oftentimes these women were put on trial with cooked up evidence, with no facts that proved the accusation. And even in the face of all of that, they were convicted and executed by juries of their peers. No evidence was ever presented. It was just blind superstition driven by uneducated men in service of protecting their status quo. That's what we saw in the early colonial period, and we just saw another version of that in Texas. What we recently saw in Texas was a set of sentences that are so far beyond the pale and so out of step with the actual quote-unquote crime that was committed that it should make everybody take pause and it should make everybody irate. So what happened in Texas? Well, the TLDR of what happened in Texas is that anti-ICE protesters were arrested and sentenced to decades in prison in the latest crackdown on dissent. And this is part and parcel straight out of the authoritarian playbook. This is not a Trump issue. This is a Republican issue. And you can argue that this is a uniquely American issue where the powers that be don't want any attacks that challenge their authority. And that's what this was. Anti-ICE protesters in 2025 assembled outside of a detention center in Texas where that detention center was being used as an effective concentration camp in the rounding up and disappearing of migrants. Now, the story goes that these protesters were involved in some sort of attack on government facilities and government officials. Now, none of the people that were arrested have actually admitted to such a thing. And it really calls into question the facts around the case. Because when we're thinking about squashing dissent, let's also think about what happened during the BLM riots, where the narrative was that these were the protesters that were causing the damage, when in fact, there were coordinated groups of white nationalists and accelerationists who were inciting crowds into violence and who started the trend of causing damage. The Boogaloo Boys, for one, was one group that was later found to be guilty. Now, in this particular case in Texas, the story goes that protesters were assembled around this detention center / concentration camp and set off fireworks. In the course of that protest, the story goes that someone in the crowd shot a police officer with an AR-15. That person hasn't been identified. None of the people who were arrested have admitted to that particular action. In fact, there is no evidence that ties any of these people that were arrested, tried, and sentenced to any violent action aimed at overthrowing the government. But they don't need the evidence because this is a narrative that is designed to be pushed out to chill anyone that would dare protest against this government and also set up the permission structure and the precedent that allows for the government to accuse anyone and everyone who is opposed to their actions as belonging to some group that doesn't exist. And that's the narrative that we need to understand. The Trump regime signed an executive order that said that anyone that is dissenting against what they want to do is an enemy of the state and that should be labeled a domestic terrorist. And in fact, that's what they've done when they've labeled Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. Now, keep in mind, they've labeled Antifa a domestic terrorist organization. This organization doesn't exist. It doesn't have a formal leadership structure. It doesn't have any bases or operating structure in the US, but yet they've created it as a way to justify harsh punishments like this in order to squash free speech. Now, compare and contrast how they're treating Antifa as a group to how they treat the Proud Boys, the Patriot Front, the KKK, the Oath Keepers, all of these groups that were involved in J6. And that's where the interesting contrast comes into play. None of the people that were sentenced to decades in jail out of Texas have done anything or were accused of doing anything that approaches what 1,500 domestic terrorists on January 6th have done. They legitimately tried to overthrow the government and stage a coup, and they were pardoned by this regime. And that is an important distinction to keep in mind. When you look at this double standard, it tells you exactly what the Republican Party is about. The Republican Party is about upholding and advancing white Christian nationalism and white supremacy. And anyone who stands opposed to that is an enemy of the state. That is the message that they're sending through. And the key thing for all of us to remember as we look at how this is played out, there's no evidence linking any of these people to belonging to an organized terror cell. There is no evidence that indicates that these people were involved in the shooting of the police officer. There is no evidence that they were part of some sort of grand conspiracy. There's also not a ton of evidence that says that all of these people were colluding on some coordinated action. There are bits and pieces of things that have been strung together to make the appearance as if it's some grand conspiracy. And the only reason that it's actually stood up is because the people that were issuing the sentences and prosecuting the case had a vested interest in doing whatever they can to preserve the structure that they're currently operating in. Plain and simple, this entire case is built on lies and misinformation. And that is what this regime traffics in. And the lesson that we need to understand is that even the slightest pushback against what this regime is doing is going to yield this sort of reaction. And if that is the case, and if that is the pattern that they're setting forward, well, maybe we need to reevaluate what our response should be. If the sentences are going to mirror what happened during the Salem witch trials, if the evidence is going to be as cooked up and as legitimate as what happened during the Salem witch trials, then maybe the people who are pushing against the police state and protesting peacefully need to switch their tactics and really draw some blood and earn those convictions and sentences. If the outcome is going to be the same anyways, what difference does it make? Maybe we should rethink the entire strategy about peaceful protests and turn this into something that is a little bit more kinetic. Maybe we can borrow a few pages out of the book of Paper Mario or Luigi. Just food for thought. If you're going to end up in the same place anyways, might as well make it count.